One of the things when we talk about seniors and housing is the issue of gentrification and displacement. With me are Mark Abbott from Harris State University and Catalina Freixas from Washington University, here to talk about gentrification and displacement and how it affects our seniors. With that.
So today we're going to talk about gentrification, and we're going to talk about the good, and the bad, and the ugly. Just a little bit about who we are. My name again is Mark Abbott, and I'm a professor of history and urban affairs at Harris State University. And I'm also the director for the Center for Neighborhood Affairs at the university. My main research deals with urban planning. So I think I'll let Catalina talk a little bit about herself.
I can project my voice. So I'm Catalina Freixas. I'm an assistant professor of architecture at Washington University in St. Louis. I'm director of Architectural Discovery Program. And my interest in research is the relationship between design, triple bottom line sustainability, and resiliency in neighborhoods in general.
So I guess maybe just a couple words about why we're here. So Catalina and I have been spending the last couple of years looking at racial segregation in the city of St. Louis, and also looking at the role of inclusion in neighborhood sustainability. So our research has been funded to date by the Divided City Initiative, which is a program at Washington University that is funded by the Mellon Foundation, and that the purpose of the grant is to encourage faculty to develop new courses, community projects, and research which will help explain segregation not only in St. Louis but elsewhere. And Catalina and I have been fortunate to have received 2 awards. The first was to create a course that we've been co-offering at Harris Stowe and at Washington University called Segregation by Design. And the purpose of that course is to look at causes and consequences of segregation, as well as to look at potential mitigation strategies. But the main reason why we're here today is to talk about some of our research which deals with inclusion and neighborhood resiliency. And so we've been looking at various factors which have led to long-term neighborhood vitality. And we're going to talk more about that. But we've also been fortunate to receive some other awards. Bring Your Own Idea, which is another internal grant program at WashU, the Creative Activity Research Grant, and a grant from the City Studio. But before we really kind of launch into our research, I think it's important to kind of tell you a little bit about who we are, because that's going to kind of shape our interpretation of our findings. So the first thing I'd like to point out is that I grew up in Indianapolis, which makes me a real Hoosier, not one of these fake Missouri Hoosiers. And I grew up in a working class family about 2 miles from the racetrack. So I went to Catholic Boys High School, which was probably equivalent to CBC here in St. Louis. And then after that, I went to Indiana University, and then Purdue University at IUPUI, better known as Ooey Pooey, which is the equivalent at UMSL. And then after that, my wife and I, we both went to Purdue. So speaking of my wife, she went to the all-girls Catholic high school across the street, and so we've been married for 45 years. Next, I guess it's in 2 weeks, on May the 12th. But on May the 14th, so I was 19 minus 2 days, and Lynn was 18. But on May 14th, I'm going to turn 65. And so the preferred term I like is geezer. But one of the things I like to do on my birthday, and I can't do this year because my oldest son is getting hooded for his Ph.D. at the University of Wisconsin in Madison on my birthday, but so I always like to take a 100-mile bike ride, and so I'm going to do that in a couple of weeks. But I guess I'm not really dreading turning 65 that much, because I don't know why. Because I guess I really don't feel 65 yet, and I don't know what that's supposed to feel like. But in any case, after going to Uipui, I went to Purdue, and my Ph.D. is in American Studies, and I was trained as an intellectual historian. So most of my master's work dealt with the Puritans. But as I went further into graduate work, I started to become more and more interested in urban studies. And my PhD dissertation was an intellectual history of 20th century American master planning. Pretty exciting stuff. But my title at Harris Stowe is Professor of History. And as we all know, historians are the most liberal people on the planet. But that's not exactly true. Actually, people that have PhDs in American Studies are actually more liberal. And so I guess I'm saying that to kind of warn you about some of my conclusions, and that I'm probably going to say some things that may surprise you and may even be somewhat offensive. But I guess I just want to point out and kind of forewarn you that, especially on economic issues, I'm probably left of Lenin. And so I didn't vote for Trump, just for the record. So, Catalina.
Okay, so a little bit about my background. I grew up in Argentina. I'm fourth generation of architects. My grandmother was one of the first architects in my country. And of course, she was looked down by a lot of people because she dared to become an architect. I also have a diploma in architecture and urbanism. My concentration on my 6th year at the university was in urban issues. So I was very interested in something different than in St. Louis. My city is extremely big. I come from a city that is 15 million people. So I was interested in how do we deal with that incredible sprawling suburbia, because it is not like here in St. Louis that you have a sprawling suburbia and what I call the hollow cheese, that is the downtown St. Louis. What I have is an enormous amount of people in the city that cannot fit in the city, so they have to sprawl because they cannot fit in the city. I'm a registered architect as well, so I have built housing. I have dealt with some housing for seniors in the past. I also like to emphasize that I am an architect and I teach architecture studios, although my focus is in environmental issues. I have taught biomimicry and I teach environmental systems. Now, in terms of some of the things that Mark is trying to show you about our character, as I said, I come from a fourth generation of architects, and I have a Latina family, correct? I'm Latina, and my family is very spread. So the way that we live in our cities, in general, our grandparents come to live with us. So for us, it's very typical that sometimes you do not decrease at certain time the space. Actually, you increase it because your grandparents are actually coming to you. Another thing that maybe will resonate as we are moving forward is I did not vote for Trump. First, because I did not have the naturalization on time. I should have had it, so I could have got one vote against him. But the most important thing is that I do believe in what UNESCO, and a lot of you might not know what I'm talking about, in the declaration talks, that is, everybody deserves education, everybody deserves housing, everybody deserves the possibility to be fed and to be nourished. And I believe on those terms. So when it comes to housing, not understanding housing as a public and social issue becomes extremely strange to me. That was my first shock when I came here to St. Louis. the lack of clarity in what constitutes affordable housing, what constitutes market rate housing, and what constitutes, if there's any, public housing.
So I guess the reason that we spent so much time kind of giving you some personal background is that what's probably going to happen is that this is going to be more of a debate than a presentation. That our ideas are still kind of evolving. I've gone, where's Charles? He was saying that his ideas about gentrification and displacement are probably somewhat different than most people. I think a lot of people are going through a lot of different kind of evolutions concerning gentrification and displacement, and that, and so I think, you know, it's true that for Catalina and myself that our ideas are still kind of evolving, and mine have kind of taken a radical shift in the last month or so due to some reading that I've been doing. But in any case, we're going to be talking about whether or not gentrification is bad, whether it's always bad or always good. Can it be prevented? Well, can displacement be prevented? And a term that I've just recently come up with is pezzification, which is the opposite of gentrification, and whether or not that is always bad. So I think disagreement is good on this issue. That I think it's important and crucial that we have a healthy debate about this very complex issue. So I think it's important first to just kind of lay out a definition about what gentrification is. And so looking at the origin of the term, gentry is a medieval term. It refers to lower nobility. And so we're talking about kind of the upper middle class in medieval society. And so the opposite of gentry would be the peasants. And so during the Middle Ages, there were only two classes. You had the peasants on the bottom and the nobility on the top. But when we talk about gentrification in contemporary terms, what it refers to is introducing people of a higher economic status, or also introducing new businesses into an area. And so, again, the title of our talk is The Good and the Bad and the Ugly in terms of gentrification. And so looking at the good, that once you bring in residents of higher economic status, that necessarily is going to stimulate an influx of capital into a neighborhood, which causes investment and theoretically revitalization of distressed and vacant properties. And so maybe another kind of personal note. Again, I'm originally from Indiana, but my wife and I, we moved here in '87 from Boston, and we've lived in Tower Grove Heights since 1989. And so Tower Grove Heights is technically not a city neighborhood. It's part of Tower Grove South, which is just south of Tower Grove Park, west of Grand, and looking at the southern border of the Heights would be Utah, and the western border would be Gustine. And so I'm going to refer a lot to my experience in the Heights, because I think it's indicative of some of the good things and also some of the bad things that happens with gentrification. But you know, looking at what happened in Tower Grove Heights when we first moved in, there was all of a sudden kind of an influx of what many sociologists refer to as urban pioneers. And that a lot of the housing stock, especially on the streets that had single-family residences, were starting to be rehabbed. But activity on South Grand, the commercial district, was rather slow. But as more urban pioneers moved in, then businesses started to pick up, and so South Grand now is one of the healthier areas in the city. But also another positive potentially is that the neighborhood has increased political power, so that when higher income people come in, that they tend to have more influence, that they have better connections with the aldermen, with City Hall, and that they're simply able to get things done. So as a result, you have better schools, better amenities, so forth and so on. In terms of our research, it appears that some gentrification is definitely a good thing, that neighborhoods that have mixed income, that are mixed income, tend to be more stable. And again, looking at Tower Grove Heights, and just kind of give you a quick kind of visual description of the neighborhood, that across the street on Arsenal from the park, you have mostly two-family residences. And the reason why they probably weren't built out as single family was that Arsenal was one of the major streetcar lines in the city. And so there was a lot of noise. But on Hartford Street, which is the street where we live, is mostly single-family residences. So in my block, there are 42 single-family houses and 7 multifamily structures with 21 apartments. There are 3 interior streets, which would be Connecticut, Wyoming, and Humphrey. And these are mostly 2-family and 4-family, which initially were probably mostly owner-occupied. And then the southernmost street of the neighborhood is Utah, and that by deed restriction, houses on Utah had to be designed by an architect and had to, the neighborhood was built out between 1905 and 1908, and so we're talking about almost 100 years ago, or just over 100 years ago, and the deed restriction specified that the houses had to sell for at least $14,000. Now, $14,000 in 2017 dollars would be close to somewhere around $420,000. And so I guess what I'm saying here is that the neighborhood was built out roughly between 1905 and 1908. It went through kind of a golden age in the teens and 20s, and in the 30s it had some slippage, but what's surprising is that the neighborhood was fairly stable even during the Depression. Now, after the World War II, there's going to be some movement out from the neighborhood, and my initial analysis suggests that the first people to leave were probably the people on Utah, the higher income residents. And the reason why they left was because that they were moving out to the suburbs for newer amenities, things like bigger kitchens, bigger bathrooms, more bathrooms, air conditioning, things of that nature. But as they moved out, the single-family streets and the multifamily streets remained fairly stable. But probably the next group to move out were people on Hartford and Juniata, and they were doing virtually the same thing, that they were looking for these additional amenities. But the last area to sort of decline a little bit was the streets in the middle that had the multifamily dwellings. And so the point I'm trying to make is as a neighborhood goes through different phases of, being popular or not popular, that by having these different price points, that it can go through different waves of change. During the 80s, that the first houses that were rehabbed were the ones on Utah, and then you had the houses on Hartford and Juniata, and then finally you had the houses on the interior streets, which would be Wyoming, Humphrey, and Connecticut. And so there's always been kind of this ebb and flow. But since we're, focusing on senior living today, the other thing that I think is important is that people have been able to go through different life phases because there have been different kinds of housing in the neighborhood. So that probably in many cases people are going to start out with the multifamily, two-family, that they're going to be owner-occupants, and that their tenants are going to help them pay the mortgage. And then once they have a certain amount of financial stability, that they move up to a house on Hartford or Juniata. And if they really made it, then they might go to Utah. But the other thing about Tower Grove Heights and kind of the general neighborhood that we live in, that there has been senior housing on Grand since the 20s. So that you have Tower Grove Manor on Grand across the street from the park, and then across from there you have Beaujolais Manor, which is Beaujolais Manor, which is quite a bit newer. But I mean, you could literally go through all your life phases in the neighborhood, and so my wife already has us planned to live in Tower Grove Manor, and I suspect we'll probably finish out our days in Beaujolais. But I guess the bottom line is that gentrification in many ways is a good thing because it helps an area weather change and to be flexible. So Catalina, you want to say?
So what constitutes this mixed income household? So according to our research, we look at this distribution of range of household incomes that includes redevelopment efforts. As Mark was pointing out, it's important that the neighborhood, again, through stages of rise and decline, things come back in a certain way. I see neighborhood as cyclical, not as something steady, but cyclical, because we are all individuals that have different stages in life, and that's what happens in neighborhood. They recycle themselves. The other thing is important is the spatial strategy for mixing different incomes groups together. So again, in terms of that spatial distribution, is very much explained by Mark when he talks about how the different streets were allocated different kind of housing. So some of them are houses, some of them are duplexes, quadruplexes, and so on and so forth. So that gives you another variety in terms of how you can produce that mixed income or mixed age pot that we are trying to get. The other thing that is going to be important is the proportion of the dwellings units designated to those homeowners or renters. So last year, I had another grant that I received to work with the International Institute. And the International Institute right now, the populations that they are receiving are extremely large. So sometimes they come with these families that have 8 kids. So how do you allocate space, or how can you actually house those families today? It's very difficult. There are not a lot of structures that can hold those things, especially because if you think about some of those quadruplexes or duplexes that Mark was talking about have been, again, look at what I said before in the first bullet, redevelopment, they have been converted into single family houses. So it's interesting to see that, on the other hand, another research that we have been doing in the Central West End, at one of the most well-known private street, that is Wartts in the Central West End, right now one of those big mansions is being transformed into actually housing units. So as you can see, there are different ways that different neighborhoods approach this kind of redevelopment because of the needs and desires of the individuals that are actually trying to live in those neighborhoods. The other thing is important is the length of time that selected housing units are guaranteed to be subsidized for low-income families if we want to get this mixed income housing. And Mark is going to talk a little bit more about this, but also we had a very interesting experience through the Divided City in looking at 3 different cities. One was Detroit, and in Detroit we look at a particular neighborhood called Indian Village. The other one was Cincinnati, Ohio, and the third one was Tower Grove Heights, St. Louis. Now in Cincinnati, Ohio, the tradition of and the very loaded social agenda of the city allowed for a lot of the units in over the Rhine to be managed by nonprofit organizations that are dedicated to housing. So those are guaranteed in a way to be preserved for those low-income households. So the interesting thing is that what we observed in over the Rhine is that you have $300 a month maybe rent in one unit next to $1 million condominium in the next one. So one of the things that is interesting to see or to talk about is it is sustainable. Will these communities, this is something that we talk with Mark and debate a lot, will these communities be able to sustain the $300 a month paid, and they will not be in a way moved or set aside in a way because of different issues. Not necessarily because of the housing is not going to be provided, because most likely those nonprofits are going to still be there and supporting those households. But Mark we were talking about yesterday about what about services? If the local supermarket, which may be the equivalent to a Shop and Save or an Aldi, is displaced and now you have a Schnucks or a Schraub's, how can you afford to still live in the neighborhood? So the other thing is the relative income levels of residents living in the surrounding neighborhood. So it's not only what you have within the neighborhood itself, what is the pressure on the sites community that you have, again, in the proximities.
Besides mixed income, we've identified a few other major factors or characteristics of neighborhoods that have displayed long-term sustainability or resiliency. And we think that these are important not just for seniors, but for all residents. But accessibility to surrounding communities, that you don't want a neighborhood to be isolated from the rest of the city, that it's very important that a neighborhood has a strong community-based organization or a neighborhood association. I think that's been particularly important in the Heights and also in Tower Grove South. And I think it's important that, well, one of the things that makes a strong neighborhood association is that it has a broad-based age representation, so that a neighborhood association needs to have seniors, it needs to have middle-aged people, and it also needs to have some youth. A strong neighborhood has strong educational options and facilities, that you want to have influx of new urbanites, young people. I always say that kids are like the canaries of a neighborhood, that you want to see young children playing on the street, but you also want to see seniors as well, because then that means that that a neighborhood is not just for young families. It's also important that a neighborhood is close to a commercial district, and that there are things that you can walk to, that you have a mixed-use commercial district, and that there is racial, ethnic, age, sexual preference diversity, and also a very strong sense of place. And so looking at seniors, walkability and transportation, as Mark Tranel pointed out, is very important. But looking at gentrification, gentrification has negative consequences for both seniors and for neighborhoods as a whole. And so in terms of the worst case scenario, that residents are evicted by new owners. So one of my first jobs out of graduate school was working for a community action program in Boston. And so one of the things that I did was to set up mediations between landlords and tenants. And at the time, this was the early 80s, and Boston was going through an economic boom. And the area that we lived in was, the neighborhood was called Medford, and it was probably equivalent to maybe Maplewood. And just like Maplewood today, Medford was going through this housing boom, and a lot of young people were buying up properties and rehabbing them. And I remember a very, very difficult mediation to set up was between an older couple that had lived in an apartment for, decades. And this young couple wanted them out. And in that, they not only wanted them out, that they wanted them to pay for damages. And so both the man and the woman in the couple had been long-term smokers, and that this couple wanted the older couple to pay for smoke damages. And I can't even remember how this turned out, but I think in the end the couple had to leave. And I thought it was an extremely sad situation that this couple was forced to leave what had been their home for most of their lives. But usually what happens is that people aren't forced out through eviction or buyouts. That what usually happens is that residents voluntarily move, and simply because they can no longer afford it. So for younger people, typically it's rent. But for many seniors, it's property taxes. That if a neighborhood goes up in value, the value of the house not only goes up, but annual taxes go up as well. And so in neighborhoods that are going through a dramatic boom, even property owners are forced out. But the city can also be a cause of displacement. Again, looking at my own personal experience, and I was actually talking to my wife about this last night, and she reminded me that when we first moved in, we were hit repeatedly by citations from the city that Tower Grove Heights had just become a conservation district, and that we were cited for peeling paint and a poor sidewalk and a number of other offenses. And so, the purpose of having a conservation district is to make sure that conditions remain stable, but for many people that this can be a real hardship, especially seniors who are on a fixed budget. And so in preparing this slideshow, we came up with this graphic of the hottest neighborhoods in the country. And so this is for 2017. And what struck me when I looked at the list was that number 10 was Treme. So Treme is a neighborhood in New Orleans. And my wife and I, we went down there over spring break, and the houses are tiny. And so we were looking at Zillow, and these houses are literally railroad houses, and we're talking now about $300,000 for some of these houses, which is remarkable because this neighborhood was almost completely underwater, during the flood. But what's also remarkable is that, or noteworthy, is that historically it's been predominantly an African-American neighborhood. But because of gentrification and the fact that this is such a hot neighborhood now, that many of these long-time African-American residents are being forced out. So looking at potential solutions or remedies to gentrification, one idea is to have a community land trust. So a community land trust is a nonprofit organization that purchases land with the intent of holding on to it and having control over ownership, so that the property owners have equity in their homes, but the land trust actually owns the land and is able to control how it's transferred from one owner to the next. Also, there are another tool is community benefit agreements. So if you have a developer that's coming in and doing a lot of renovation, that part of the deal is that that they write literally a contract with the neighborhood, and that in many cases these agreements are going to set aside so many units that are going to be either sold at a particular price or rented at a particular rent. Another tool is the formation of a community development corporation, so that a CDC is actually a developer, a nonprofit developer, and as a nonprofit developer can control how many units are going to be at a particular rent, or how many units are going to be sold at a particular price. Another tool, it's really not used that often in St. Louis because the housing market isn't that hot here, is something called inclusionary zoning, where a developer is required to set aside a certain percentage of units that are supposed to be affordable.
So again, this goes back to Over the Rhine. We have seen in Over the Rhine in a way community land trusts, and we also have seen community benefit agreements. Right now, there's a major developer that is buying a lot of these buildings, and they are renovating them. So the big question from the nonprofit organizations that are working with housing is making deals through the city on how many of the units can they actually be allocated to preserve affordable housing in this community. It's going to be very difficult. Right now, Over the Rhine is at the peak of everybody has its eyes in how it is going to, what is going to happen next. But as I said, the interesting thing is that because of the social agenda that is extremely important in Cincinnati, we still have hopes for it.
So in this case, guys go first, because this is going to set up our argument. Because this is something that Catalina and I have been kind of not fighting about, but having intense conversations. And so again, looking at Over the Rhine, you know, the CBAs have set aside a certain percentage of affordable units, and you do have a situation where you have, you know, apartments literally going for $300 a month next to $1 million condos. But looking at this, even if you do set aside units for renters, that this doesn't protect the rent of support services. So it doesn't ensure that you have, you know, facilities that are cheap enough for homeless shelters. You don't have, you know, other kinds of facilities for substance abuse. All of these are kind of crucial for you know, a certain segment of the population. And so in terms of seniors, you would want to have space set aside for senior daycare, health care clinics, and things of this nature. And so the point is that raising kind of the basic income level past a certain point is going to make it harder and harder for certain kinds of amenities and services to be placed. And so in St. Louis, like most major cities, a third of the residents live in poverty. And as Mark Trinnell pointed out, that even looking at seniors, we're still talking about a fifth of the senior population in the city. And so this has been made worse by federal housing policies. That the thrust of federal housing policy today is to replace public housing and senior housing, not so much with senior housing, but certainly with public housing. But I'm thinking of Blumeyer, and that even some of the high-rise senior housing was replaced. And that the idea is that you want to replace communities of concentrated poverty that are mixed income. And so because of that, the poor are becoming more and more dependent upon the private market. And as we heard earlier this morning, that while a very large percentage of seniors are eligible for assistance, that many, if not most, are not receiving it. And so the outrageous thing that I wanted to suggest is that for a certain segment of our population, that we almost need to protect our slums in order to ensure that we have enough affordable housing if we're going to be this dependent upon market rate housing or the private market. And that, looking at, past policy, in 1949, we passed the Housing Act, which declared that all Americans deserve a decent place to live. And in the 60s, we allegedly fought a war on poverty. And so apparently we lost that war and we surrendered because even in this last election, there was virtually no mention of the poor or of seniors, and that we've simply kind of forgotten our neediest citizens. And so, so I guess what I'm suggesting, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, is that we almost need to keep the middle class and the wealthy out of certain neighborhoods to ensure that we have enough housing for not just the poor, but also for seniors. And so the way to do that is that in certain areas that you would concentrate, NIMBYs are not in my backyards, that certain neighborhoods would be off limits in terms of historic designation, and that you need to provide deeply affordable housing, which would be smaller units. And so I guess in terms of my bottom line is that St. Louis and America really doesn't have a gentrification problem. It has a class problem. And as long as we accept the existence of such a widespread income distribution, then we're going to continue to have problems housing both our poor and our seniors. And I think this chart shows it all. So that 3/4 of our population, the median household income is below $85,000. But for the top 1%, the median household income is over $500,000. So I think if we're ever going to solve our housing problem, we have to address poverty for all segments of our population.
Let's give them a round of applause, please. One of the things that we wanted to do today was to honor someone who has spent a great deal of time making sure our city, county, region really took effort to have fair and equal housing opportunity for all, and made sure that we stuck not only to the letter, but to the spirit of the Fair Housing Acts.
He was always respectful and mindful of the work that the city needed to do itself to have affordable housing and fair housing. But he also was a person who always said, why can't you do more? Why can't you improve? Why can't you do better?
By words and example, Ed Wartts has courageously strived to eradicate bias when it comes to equal access to housing for all people throughout the St. Louis metropolitan area. On STL TV, he talked about the work his office does.
For the city of St. Louis that receives some $20 million a year from HUD, we also go out and take a look at how that money is used and to make sure that it's provided on an equal basis and that development is not done in one particular area but in all areas of the city and where the greatest need would occur.
Ed joined the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development as a fair housing investigator in 1993.
Ed came to HUD as a temporary, 6-year temporary employee, and he has grown and provided leadership in terms of fair housing issues in the metropolitan area. Ed's work will always be remembered as someone who can look at an issue, analyze it, and come up and provide reasonable, fair alternatives.
Today, as director of the Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity Division in St. Louis, Ed oversees a staff that has been successful investigating complaints of housing discrimination, mortgage lending, real estate transactions, and brokerage services. Senior investigator Frank Montgomery recalls Ed's impact in several landmark cases.
I want to mention two, one being Midland State Bank. I mention this case because it provides impact in terms of money to assist first-time home buyers. The total conciliation amount for the case was roughly $16 million. In addition to the money, Ed was instrumental in insisting that Midland State Bank provide two full-service banks in St. Louis, one being Buzz Westfall Center and the other being off of Manchester, right down from the Equal Opportunity Council. These banks will be providing financial assistance to individuals. The other case I wanted to mention was a case involving Pacific Village, which is a case that provides, design and construction was the issue, and this particular apartment complex was required to retrofit roughly 28 units, which will provide affordable housing and what we call assisted housing to individuals with disabilities.
Fueling his career and all the spectacular work he has done are the values he holds. Ed's motto, "Counting time is not as important as making time count."
Thank you, thank you.
Were it not for Eddie Wartts, there would not be a CREA, or we would not be functioning the way we are. We would not be substantially equivalent. He kept pressing and pressing and pressing and saying, you all have to get this done, that you are not substantially equivalent, and you must be substantially equivalent to be in the HUD program and receive HUD funds. And so he basically, by hook or crook, made us commit to where we are now. He has been a friend, a mentor, an agitator. There's probably a few other, but at the end of the day, there are few people in government that I have met that had the veracity, that had the stick-to-itiveness and the understanding necessary to get the job done. And so if you drop this, this is on your own. On behalf of the City of St. Louis and the Civil Rights Enforcement Agency, Fair Housing Distinguished Service Award, Eddie L. Wartts, 2017.
Thank you, sir.
The floor is yours.
Thank you very, very much. I just had a few words to say today. First of all, I want to thank CREA, Charles Bryson, Denise Jefferson, and the CREA Commission for this esteemed award. I'm really honored today to receive it. I would be remiss in saying, if I didn't mention that April is Fair Housing Month, and we're celebrating the 49th anniversary of the passage of the Fair Housing Act, which was passed about 7 days after the death of Martin Luther King. And so, and that act is still very, very relevant today. The theme for this Fair Housing Month is Fair Housing Equals Opportunity. You know, and it brings to mind, too, we have a lot more work to do. I mean, we've made substantial progress, but we have a lot more to do. Ferguson is a simple, simply a microcosm of communities that exist all around this country, that are entrenched in segregation, which in turn perpetuates poor quality housing, a lack of good quality jobs, education, health care, and infrastructure improvements. I often think that I could not have had a better job. For those of you who wouldn't have known me back in high school, I was a hellraiser. I was also a hellraiser going all the way through college. I wrote articles in the school newspaper, and one of the most important articles that I wrote was about the school's investment in countries that were in South Africa. And as a result of that, I was summoned to the president's office, and I said, oh man, I'm gonna get kicked out for sure. But what he asked me, he said, well, so what do you propose that we do in this situation? So we discussed it. The school eventually got rid of those shares in those companies, and I think it made for a better school all around. I've been blessed to work with a wide array of talented and dedicated individuals who assist in our fight for civil rights, who work side by side and in many cases take the lead in the issues that we are faced with today. And I refer to those individuals in borrowing a term from Dr. Cornel West. I call them the intellectual freedom fighters, because we do need, people in all segments of our country to embark on this fight with us. I started at HUD some 24 years ago, and at the time that I started, CREA was no longer in the Fair Housing Assistance Program. They left the program probably in about 1992 as a result of a change in the Fair Housing Law, which as a result took away their substantial equivalency. But I've given Mayor Slay praise on his courage in stepping forward and making sure that we got a local fair housing law on the books. And I've said that on a number of occasions. He came over to the HUD office a couple of weeks ago, and I was able to commend him again as well. But I think I've been a little bit remiss in that one of the most important people in helping us to get this law back on the books was Charles Bryson. And he was right. I bugged the hell out of him because we wanted this done. But without Charles, we would not have a law on the books today. I mean, he had the mayor's ear, and he kept assuring me, because I said, Charles, we got to get it done. And he kept assuring me that it would be done. And at that time, our assistant secretary was coming to town and wanted to announce it. So I was biting my nails all the while up to the point that he said that it was done. So I wanted to commend Charles on all of his wonderful efforts in terms of getting this law on the book. It takes a village to raise a child, and I wonder what it will take to address the pressing issues of race and inequality that plagues this nation. What will it take to raise our communities of color that are constantly battered by crime, a lack of decent, affordable housing, segregation, and a lack of jobs, a lack of quality education and health care for our children? I believe that it will take the unrelenting efforts of a nation as we strive to reach the summit of human evolution, which is to judge each other by our character and not by the color of our skins. Dr. King encouraged us to continue the fight for human rights with urgency, saying, we have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to make the tranquilizing drug of gradualization. Now is the time to make real promises. Now is the time to make the real promises of democracy real. We still have much work to do. We must remain committed. We must never accept mediocrity. We must be dedicated, and above all, we must rely upon and apply God-given luck. It's not the kind of luck that we hope for when we buy a lottery ticket, but it's luck that stands for L, love, U, understanding, C, compassion, and K, kinship. I leave you with the words of the Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. We must dissent from indifference. We must dissent from apathy. We must dissent from the fear, the hatred, and the mistrust. We must dissent from a nation that has buried its head in the sand, waiting in vain for the needs of the poor, its elderly, and its sick to disappear and just blow away. We must dissent from a government that has left its young without jobs, education, or hope. We must dissent from the poverty of wisdom and the absence of moral leadership. We must dissent because America can do better, because America has no choice but to do better. Thank you.